This is the 12th session of the series, How We Got Our Bible. As always, thanks are due to the inspiration and substance of David Ewart's book, A General Introduction to the Bible, From Ancient Tablets to Modern Translations, and to Zondervan Publishers for permission to draw much of this lecture from it. To date, we have seen how writers from many backgrounds in different lands and languages were moved by the Spirit to compose the 66 books that we call the Bible. We have seen how these books were preserved and collected and ultimately formed into a canon, first for the Old Covenant and then for the New. And we have followed the text of the Bible down to the dawn of printing. It remains, though, to see how, over the centuries, the Greek of the New Testament was translated into the languages of believers. It began, of course, at Pentecost, A.D. 33. When the Spirit fell on the apostles, they began to speak in other languages, a message from God that the good news of Jesus was to go not just to the Jews, but to all the peoples of the world. And there was an audience there waiting for it. Acts 2:5 tells us, "Now there were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven." This microcosm served to prefigure how the gospel would reach the world through translation. And so it did. As the missionaries fanned out through the Near East, they soon reached people for whom their own Aramaic was foreign, and for whom Greek was equally challenging. They began translating the Word into Syriac. A scholar named Tatian, whose zeal had made him an ascetic and whose unusual views had brought him in trouble in the West, began in around 160 A.D. to make a very odd translation. He undertook to weave the four gospel narratives into one single story. His Diatessaron used the basic structure of Mark, inserting portions of Matthew, Luke, and John wherever they seemed to fit. Quirky as it was, the Diatessaron became popular enough that some of the church leaders had to caution believers not to use it instead of the actual Gospels. They soon had an alternative, the Old Syriac, begun late in the 2nd century A.D. It served for perhaps 2 centuries until a more careful translation appeared. It was called the Peshitta, the simple or common version, and soon became the standard for speakers of Syriac. Some copies of the Peshitta survive, like this one. The gospel went down into Egypt. Urbanites in places like Alexandria were comfortable with Greek, but much of the population still spoke one version or another of the ancient Egyptian tongue. And so the missionaries produced a Sahidic Coptic translation, late in the 3rd century, and a Bohairic Coptic, early in the 4th. Most of these translations were done under the pressure of time and the threat of persecution, and with limited resources. As a result, they were usually less than perfect. The Coptic versions, for example, have some minor omissions. They do not include Jesus' call from the cross, "Father, forgive them." In the account of Jesus healing the man at the pool of Bethesda, there's no mention of an angel troubling the water. The entire account of the woman taken in adultery is omitted. And in Mark 9:29, there is no reference to fasting as a requirement to heal. Farther south lay Ethiopia. Perhaps the official from the court of Candace, converted by Philip, had introduced the faith there, or perhaps others had, but in any event, they needed a Bible in their language. In the 5th or 6th centuries, they had one, and Christianity has endured there ever since. Preachers went north from Jerusalem too, some to the area east of the Black Sea. A translation was needed there for the people of Georgia, and by the 400s they had one. Their neighbors to the south, in Armenia, responded to the gospel, and the preachers responded with an Armenian translation. There are some uncertainties about these two translations. Some scholars believe the Armenian translation may have been done from the Syriac rather than the Greek, and that the Georgian may have been from the Armenian. That would mean that the latter was a translation of a translation of a translation. It's rather interesting that we have a substantial number of manuscripts of the Armenian translation, more than almost any of these ancient ones, except, of course, for the Vulgate. The gospel went southeast from Jerusalem, too, into the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula. Soon there was a need for an Arabic version of the message, and by the 6th or 7th century, it was in circulation. Here's one of those manuscripts, prepared by a professional scribe in Greek, but with Arabic running down the margin. That version soon had to compete with the new faith of Islam, and we'll have to return to that topic shortly. But first, there is the church in the West. Rome dominated the whole Mediterranean world, of course, but in the East it ruled over people who had some knowledge of Greek. In the West, though, it was Latin that prevailed. Very early, the Christians began translating their message into Latin. The history books speak about an Old Latin translation, but in fact there were several such translations, all done in haste, and all competing with one another. We know the New Testament books were available in Latin quite early. One example comes from the persecutions. In AD 180, a believer named Spiratus was brought before the Roman magistrate, who asked him what was in that small box he held so close. "Books and letters of a just man, one Paul," he replied. On the one hand, it was a blessing that the faithful had their sacred book in Latin, but on the other, it was unfortunate that the translations were of poor quality. St. Augustine, looking back on those days, expressed his disdain about it. Quote, "In the early days of the faith, every man who happened to gain possession of a Greek manuscript, and who imagined he had any facility in both languages, however slight that might have been, dared to make a translation. And when the time came for Jerome to begin work on what would be the official Latin version, he observed that there were almost as many Latin translations as there were manuscripts for him to work from." Though lacking in scholarly precision, some of these old Latin translations were prepared with love. Here's a page from the Codex Veronensis. It is written on purple parchment, and the writing is in silver and gold ink. Here's another example, Codex Gigas. It contained the complete Bible, Old and New Testaments, on pages 20 by 36 inches. It was so heavy that it took 2 men to lift it. That image of Satan there, though, moved some people to nickname it the Devil's Bible. But as the church grew in numbers and influence, something needed to be done about those amateurish Latin Bibles. And in 382, something was. Pope Damasus commissioned Jerome to do an official translation of the entire Bible from the Hebrew and Greek. Jerome was a splendid choice for the task. A brilliant man with a flair for language study, he had always been a voracious reader, especially of the Greek and Latin classics. Then, when traveling in the East, he became ill, and in his fevered state had a life-changing dream. He found himself standing before God. "What are you?" God asked. Jerome replied, "I am a Christian." "No," said the Lord, "you are a Ciceronian." Guilt-stricken that his love for the Roman orator's works had been revealed, he begged for mercy and promised never to read another pagan book. Well, he didn't really keep that vow, but the direction of his life was changed. He concluded that it was God's will for him to devote himself to some great work of faith. And so he took up Damas's challenge and began what would become the Bible of most Christians for 1,000 years. But it was not a popular undertaking, as he soon discovered. He later complained, quote, "If I correct errors in the sacred text, I am denounced as a falsifier. If I do not correct them, I am pilloried as a disseminator of error." But he persevered, and for the remainder of his life this was his obsession. Once completed, the Latin Vulgate, the term means the common version, the one for everybody, became the centerpiece of Christian study and instruction. With the passage of years, some revisions were made. In the 600s, and again in the 800s, and then in the 1300s. And there was one more major attempt to improve the work. Pope Sixtus V commissioned a revision in 1590, to be completed and published in 1592 by his successor, Clement VIII. It was then called the Sixto Clementine Vulgate, and it is that version that has remained the official Latin Bible of the Roman Catholic Church ever since. David Ewart rightly observes, "In the history of Bible translation, no version, other than the Septuagint, has had such a profound influence on Christianity." But of course there were peoples, even in the West, for whom Latin was a foreign tongue. When Christianity came to the Goths, they needed the word in their language, and the same was true when missionaries reached the Slavs in the 800s. But for each of these, the task of translation was especially daunting. These two peoples had no written language. Ulfilas, in the 300s, had been a missionary in the regions of Romania and Bulgaria and knew what had to be done. He first created an alphabet for them, and then translated from the Septuagint and the Greek New Testament to meet their need. A similar task faced Cyril and Methodius, who had been commissioned by the Byzantine emperor in 863 to help the new believers among the Slavs. Cyril designed an alphabet for them, and then translated the Bible from Greek into it. That alphabet still bears his name, Cyrillic, and it has served the Russians well. In the 7th century, a new religion burst upon the Mediterranean world. Sweeping out of the Arabian desert, the armies of Islam moved north through Israel, Syria, and Turkey. Others turned west, conquering Egypt and rolling over North Africa. Only in Spain and at the gates of France would their advance be halted. If we have ever doubted the importance of a written Bible, we should ponder this comment from David Ewart. In territories such as Egypt and Syria, where the Bible was translated into the languages of the common people at an early stage, the Muslim conquest was unable to wipe out Christianity. In North Africa, however, where no translations into the languages of the Berber peoples were made, hardly a trace of Christianity is left. And with that in mind, we can turn at last to the quest for a Bible in English. English, of course, has changed profoundly over the centuries. Before the Norman invasion of 1066, we would scarcely be able to recognize it or to decipher it. But Christianity had been in Britain among the original Britons ever since the 200s. And then, throughout the 400s, the Angles and the Saxons invaded. They nearly succeeded in wiping out the native Britons and the fledgling Christian faith that some of them professed. The faith of Christ had to wait for the arrival of a new wave of missionaries from about 590. They came, of course, with the Latin Vulgate Bible, and both Saxons and Angles began to respond to the gospel. One bright name from this period is a cowherd named Caedmon. In about 670, he began composing tales and poems, rather like nursery rhymes, from the Bible stories. People were able to learn of David and Goliath, the birth of Jesus, and the resurrection in this simple way. They needed all the help they could get, because the priests themselves knew all too little. We see an example of that in the Landesfarne Vulgate from around Caedmon's time. Beautifully produced, though of course only a manuscript, we are still too early for printing, its pages are strangely marked. Above the neat lines of Latin text, there are these scattered words in Old English. The priests themselves had so sketchy a knowledge of Latin that they needed something like an interlinear to understand their own Bibles. We may wonder, when we see how many translations had been made of the Bible in the early centuries of the faith, why none in English? But recall how many people actually spoke English. Now, it's a second language for virtually anyone in the world. But in, say, AD 1300, the language was known only in the British Isles, and those islands were at the western edge of the civilized world. The Christian faith had come there, but supported only by a Latin Bible, and no one was translating it into English. David Ewart's observation is apt here. It is staggering to think, he said, that for 1,000 years of Christianity in England, English Christians had no Bible. And then William the Conqueror and the Normans came, and the year 1066 changed England forever. Even the language changed, gradually becoming what scholars call Middle English. For our tracing of the Bible, the next important name is John Wycliffe, born 1329. He had a dream to produce a Bible in English, and devoted himself to that dream. He had only the Vulgate to work with, and his translation was a very literal one, but at last the process was begun. Upon his death in 1384, there were some manuscript copies of most of the Bible. Here's an example of his work. All things were made by him, and withouten him was made no thing, that thing that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men, and the light shineth in darknesses, and darknesses comprehended not it. John 1, 3-5. As we might expect, though, Wycliffe's work was condemned by the Roman Church, and in 1415 the Council of Constance ordered his body dug up and burned, and his ashes thrown into the river Swift. But Wycliffe had earned the name of the Morning Star of the Reformation, and others, like Martin Luther, were coming. But there in England, John Purvey took up Wycliffe's project, revising his translation into more idiomatic English, and with the use of better texts of the Vulgate. But it was still rough. Its limitations included that it was in Middle English, that it was done from the Vulgate and not from the Greek, and remember, it was only in manuscript, not in print. Gutenberg's press was still years away. And as the Bible in England waited for the advent of printing, the English language continued to change. After 1500 or so, it had taken the form that scholars call modern English. We might wonder at that designation, but moderns can, at least, read it. And with the dawn of modern English, we find a new translator, William Tyndale. His desire to give the people a Bible in their language put him at odds with the Church, as had Wycliffe's. We are told that a clergyman asserted to Tyndale, "We had better be without God's laws than the Pope's." Tyndale replied, "I defy the Pope and all his laws, and if God spares my life, I will cause the boy that drives the plough in England to know more of the Scriptures than the Pope himself." The fact that you can find this exchange in Fox's Book of Martyrs suggests how serious his declaration was. The dangers of working in England forced Tyndale to Europe for his project. By 1526 he had translated the New Testament from Greek and parts of the Old Testament, and actually got them into print. Smuggled into England, they drew the ire of the Church, and especially one Bishop Tunstall. Unable to keep the books out, he instructed his agents to buy up all the copies and burn them. But his plan was a classic example of short-sightedness. Tyndale simply used the money to finance his second edition. That was 1534, his best version. The translator had worked in Antwerp, a free city that was relatively safe for reformers, but not safe enough for Tyndale. Emperor Charles V had him kidnapped from Antwerp, tried for heresy, and condemned. He was to be strangled and his body burned. His last words were, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." Through one of the ironies of history, King Henry VIII had just given permission for the Bible to be circulated in England, but Tyndale did not learn of it before his execution. Henry would vacillate on the topic of an English Bible, just as he did in his relations with Catholicism before he broke with it, but the tide was beginning to turn. Others followed Tyndale's example. England soon saw the Coverdale Bible, the Matthew Bible, and the Great Bible. There was the Geneva Bible, most welcomed by Scottish believers because they respected those who had done it, and the so-called Bishop's Bible. What was Tyndale's version like? Well, it had significant virtues. It was in modern English, and translated from the Greek rather than the Vulgate, and it was in print, so great numbers of copies could be produced at modest cost. It was so influential that it's estimated that 9/10 of the King James Version, when it appeared almost a century later, was Tyndale. The differences between Middle English and Modern English can be seen rather well when we compare a passage from Wycliffe with the same one in Tyndale. Wycliffe: Therefore, when the Lord of the vineyard shall come, what shall he do to thilke earthe tilliers? Tyndale: When the Lord of the vineyard cometh, what will he do with those husbandmen? Wycliffe: They sayn to him, he shall lease the yule men, and he shall set to hire his vineyard to other earthetillers, which schulen yield to him fruit in her times. Tyndale: They said unto him, he will cruelly destroy those evil persons, and will let out his vineyard unto other husbandmen, which shall deliver him the fruit at times convenient. Wycliffe: Jesus saith to him, Redden ye never in scriptures? Tyndale: Jesus said unto them, Did ye never read in the scriptures? Wycliffe: The stone which builders reproyeden, this is made into the head of the corner. Of the Lord this thing is done, and it is merciless before our eyen. Tyndale: The stone which the builders refused, the same is set in the principal part of the corner. This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. These were deeply unsettled times in England. After Henry VIII established the Church of England, we saw Mary Tudor bring back Catholicism, and then Elizabeth restored the Anglican Church. Upon her death, England recognized King James VI of Scotland. He was for them to be King James I, and to be the one to authorize the King James Version. Even before his accession, the Puritans had brought a petition to him that listed several grievances. In response, he called the Hampton Court Conference in 1604. The only significant thing it accomplished was, quote, that a translation be made of the whole Bible, as consonant as can be with the original Hebrew and Greek, and this to be set out and printed without any marginal notes, and only to be used in all churches of England in time of divine service. And so the authorized version would be born. The key elements of this project were that first it should be a committee translation, not the work of a single scholar. Officially, the bishop's Bible was to be the basis for the translation, but they were to compare it with the Hebrew and Greek, plus all English versions, as well as the German, Italian, Spanish, and Latin ones. They were to use italics for words not in the original. This choice has resulted in confusion for many readers, who assume that italicized words are the emphatic ones. Edition after edition followed the initial release in 1611, 1613, 1629, 1638. Then the passage of decades justified revisions in 1762 and 1769 to modernize the spelling. As we all know, it did not end there. New editions, reprintings, and revisions have continued to appear down to our own time, as well as controversy over whether later translations are even allowable, since this one says on its dedicatory page that it is the authorized version. But more translations have indeed been produced, and in the last lecture of this series, we will consider how a reader can choose among them. If you have questions about this lecture or any of the others in this series, you may address them to me, Dr. Jerry C. 4 at yahoo.com.